A billionaire CEO with only a few months to live adopts 3 abandoned girls. But as soon as they get home, one of them looks him in the eye and says, "We know how to save you." He freezes, and what happens next will make you cry. The silence that settled in the doctor's office was the kind that seemed to consume all the oxygen in the room. Julian Aramis, sitting in front of the spotless mahogany desk, remained as motionless as a statue carved in cold marble. Only the slight rise and fall of his chest, controlled breathing, revealed that there was still life in this aristocratic-featured man. The doctor cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses with evident discomfort. It didn't matter how many decades of practice he had. Delivering this kind of news never got easier. "Mr. Aramis, I wish I had better news." Julian merely nodded, a gesture so slight it was almost imperceptible. At 40 years old, he had built an empire. His presence caused a stir in any corporate environment. His name was synonymous with relentless success, flawless strategic vision. Powerful men trembled before his decisions. But here, confronted by papers containing test results and medical jargon incomprehensible to laypeople, he was as vulnerable as any other human being. "Advanced cancer," the words hung in the air like a sentence. 3 months to live, at best. The doctor went on about palliative treatments, quality of life, terminal care specialists. His voice seemed to come from very far away, as if Julian were submerged in deep water. 3 months, 12 weeks, 90 days, 2,160 hours. The numbers danced through his mind like an impossible equation. Julian, who always turned data into profitable strategies, now faced the cruelest math of all, the countdown of his own existence. "Mr. Aramis, any questions?" Julian stared at the doctor as if seeing him for the first time. He shook his head no. He rose with the same calculated elegance he displayed in board meetings. He straightened his custom-made Italian jacket in a habitual gesture. "Thank you for your time, doctor. No drama, no collapse, no tears." Julian Aramis left the doctor's office the same way he handled billion-dollar acquisitions, with absolute control. It was only when he stepped onto the sidewalk, after the tempered glass door of the upscale medical center had closed behind him, that the first crack in his composure appeared. His feet, once always directed toward a clear goal, now wandered aimlessly through the streets of a city he had never truly observed. The sky had a shade of blue he didn't recall ever noticing before. People passed by in a hurry, some talking on cell phones, others holding hands, each living their minutes without the acute awareness of their own mortality. Julian walked like a ghost among them, already inhabiting a liminal space between existence and absence. At a random corner, he stopped in front of a storefront. His reflection stared back. The impeccable suit, the polished Italian shoes, the precise haircut, the posture that exuded authority, the perfect image of a successful man. But his eyes, he had never realized how empty they looked. "Who will cry when I'm gone?" The thought hit him with the force of a punch to the stomach. Julian Aramis, the billionaire CEO whose decisions affected global markets, could not identify a single person who would truly miss him. Business partners would regret losing a valuable contact. Competitors would breathe easier. Employees would worry about job stability under new leadership. But genuine tears, broken hearts, a void impossible to fill, nothing. He kept walking, now aware not just of the terminal diagnosis, but of something perhaps even more devastating. The life he had built, so impressive in statistics and achievements, was utterly barren of human connections. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, calls, messages, emails, his empire demanding its commander. Julian ignored them all. For the first time in decades, work felt irrelevant, like an elaborate board game but ultimately pointless. The hours passed in a trance. The sun began to set, painting the urban horizon with shades of red and gold. Julian watched this spectacle with the curiosity of someone seeing it for the first time, calculating how many more of these sunsets he might have the privilege of witnessing. When night finally fell, his steps instinctively led him back home, if that place deserved such a designation. The personal driver, who had been waiting patiently for hours, opened the door of the Bentley without asking about his boss's whereabouts throughout the day. The mansion appeared imposing once the electronic gate opened, strategically lit to highlight its award-winning architecture. 3 stories of glass, steel and concrete, designed by a celebrity architect. A contemporary masterpiece, frequently photographed for architectural magazines. Julian climbed the steps of the main entrance and the door opened automatically, recognizing his presence. Lights switched on gently, programmed to follow his path through the immense foyer. "Good evening, sir," the digital voice of the home automation system echoed through the space. "The temperature is set to your preference. Would you like me to prepare your usual dinner?" "No," Julian replied to the AI that managed his home. Even his own voice sounded strange to his ears, as if it belonged to someone else. He walked slowly through the perfectly decorated rooms, the living room with its Italian designer sofa that had never been used for friendly chats, the dining room with a table for 12 that had never witnessed a shared meal among friends, the fully equipped bar where no meaningful toast had ever been made. He touched the carefully selected objects, contemporary sculptures, signed abstract paintings, rare pieces acquired at exclusive auctions. Impressive possessions that had never offered true pleasure beyond the fleeting satisfaction of acquisition. The silence was absolute, except for the occasional soft hum of electronic devices, a silence that had always been there, but which now seemed deafening, suffocating in its completeness. Julian Aramis, the man who had everything money could buy, finally understood that he had built not a home, but a mausoleum, a monument to his own loneliness. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the perfectly made bed, looking out through the glass wall at the city lights below. For the first time since childhood, Julian Aramis allowed silent tears to roll down his cheeks. He did not cry for the death sentence he had received that morning. He cried for the life he had never truly lived. Julian's routine changed drastically in the days following the diagnosis. The corporate empire he had built so meticulously continued to run without his constant presence, a revelation that surprised and, in a way, saddened him. Years of obsessive dedication, and the world kept turning without him. For the first time since he founded his conglomerate, Julian began ignoring insistent calls from his executives, emails piled up unread. When his personal assistant, visibly concerned, showed up at his mansion to check on his well-being, he received her briefly in the foyer. "I need time," was all he said, before instructing her to cancel all his appointments for the coming weeks. "Personal matters can't be postponed." Her look revealed doubt. Julian Aramis had never had personal matters that took precedence over business. But she only nodded, professional as ever, and left with a promise to keep everything under control. Alone again, Julian abandoned the impeccable suits that were practically his second skin. He chose casual clothes he barely knew he owned, pieces forgotten somewhere in his minimalist closet, a simple cashmere sweater, cotton trousers, shoes without the polish of the Oxfords he usually wore. And then he began to walk, with no destination, no apparent purpose, just a man walking through streets of a city he only knew from behind tinted car windows and in corporate boardrooms high up in skyscrapers. Initially, his steps took him instinctively to financial districts, as if his body didn't know how to exist far from the familiar corporate landscape. But gradually, he allowed himself to explore other paths, street markets where he had never set foot, public squares where regular people enjoyed moments of rest, neighborhood coffee shops where coffee wasn't served in fine china, but had an aroma that transported him to distant childhood memories. On the third day of these wanderings, something changed in his perception. Julian began to truly observe the people around him, not as demographic data or potential consumers, his usual professional lens, but as human beings. An elderly couple sitting on a park bench, holding hands, comfortably silent. Two friends roaring with laughter over some private joke. A mother stroking her child's hair while they waited for a bus. Small moments of genuine connection that had always happened around him, but that he had never stopped to witness. Each scene was like a pang in his chest, a painful reminder of what he had never experienced, the choices he had made along the way, the doors he had closed without even glancing at what lay behind them. On the fourth day, a light rain began to fall in the late afternoon. Julian, with no umbrella or any protection, kept walking. The feeling of raindrops on his face felt purifying. The streets started emptying as people sought shelter. That was when, turning into a quieter street, he saw them for the first time. 3 small figures huddled under the narrow awning of a closed shop. They shared a single worn-out blanket, far too colorful for the situation they found themselves in. At first glance, they could have been just a pile of discarded rags, if not for the little feet that occasionally shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position on the cold ground. Julian stopped a few steps away, unsure. For a brief moment, he considered doing what he always did upon encountering homeless individuals. Walk on, perhaps make an anonymous donation later to some charity, clean, distant, efficient. But something stopped him from moving on. Maybe it was the recent diagnosis breaking down his carefully built defenses. Maybe it was the now heavier rain soaking the small blanket that barely covered the 3 children. Julian approached slowly, trying not to scare them. The oldest of the 3 noticed him first. Her gaze instantly grew alert, one arm placed protectively in front of the other 2. Despite her tiny size, there was a fierceness in her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond her age. "Are you all right?" The question sounded foolish even to Julian's own ears. Obviously, they were not okay. "We're just waiting for the rain to stop," the oldest girl answered, her voice firm, trying to sound older than she was. "We don't need anything." Julian noticed how she held her chin high, even as an involuntary shiver ran through her small body. The middle one, with big, expressive eyes, silently watched the exchange, holding tightly onto the hand of the youngest, who, surprisingly, smiled at Julian as if he were an old friend she'd just bumped into. "Where are your parents?" Julian asked, already suspecting the answer. A heavy silence fell. The oldest just pressed her lips together, a thin line of determination. "I live nearby," Julian continued, gesturing vaguely. "I could bring something for you to eat." The mention of food made the youngest squirm excitedly, but a look from the oldest quieted her again. "We don't talk to strangers," the protective girl declared. Julian nodded, respecting her caution. "You're very smart to be careful." He took a step back. "But I'll leave something for you here, okay? You don't have to talk to me or come with me. I just want to help." Without waiting for an answer, Julian crossed to a small diner on the other side of the street. He ordered 3 hot soups, sandwiches, and some cakes. While waiting for his order, he called his driver, instructing him to pick him up but keep a discreet distance. When he returned to the girls, he placed the bag of food a few steps away from them and backed away again. "It's hot, it'll help with the cold," he said simply. For a moment, no one moved. Then the youngest, sporting a wide grin that revealed a missing baby tooth, escaped the oldest girl's protective embrace and ran to grab the bag. The pure joy on her face as she caught the aroma of the soup caused a strange feeling in Julian's chest, a tightness that wasn't entirely unpleasant. "Thank you, mister," the little one exclaimed, already carrying the package back to the others. The oldest girl carefully inspected the contents before allowing them to eat. Once she was convinced it was safe, she distributed the food among them with the naturalness of someone long accustomed to taking care of others. Julian stood back in the now gentler rain, watching them devour the meal with a silent gratitude that moved him deeply. When they finished, the middle one shyly waved at him. Julian returned the wave and, without another word, walked to the car that was waiting discreetly. The next night he returned, and the next. The girls were still there, in the same spot. The oldest girl's distrust gradually lessened with each visit. On the 3rd night, when Julian arrived with the now familiar bag of warm food, she no longer stretched her arm protectively in front of the others. The middle girl now smiled openly at him, and the youngest jumped up and down with excitement as he approached. It was on that 3rd night, as he watched them share their meal, that Julian felt something shift inside him. An inexplicable urgency, an impulse that did not come from the calculating CEO's brain, but from somewhere deeper, more primal. "It's getting colder," he commented, looking up at a sky full of heavy clouds promising more rain. "And it's going to rain again." All 3 looked at him, waiting for him to continue. Julian took a deep breath, What he was about to say was insane by any rational standard, yet rationality no longer seemed so important for a man with 3 months left to live. "Would you like to come with me?" The words came out almost without his conscious permission. "I have a warm place. Comfortable beds, food. You'd be safe." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of approaching thunder. The oldest, always the guardian, studied Julian's face for a long time, as if trying to see beyond appearances and into his soul. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she finally nodded, a solemn gesture, full of a trust that Julian suddenly realized was a huge responsibility. Minutes later, the 3 small figures were settled in the back seat of the luxurious car, marveling at the electronic controls and leather interior. Julian instructed the driver to take them home, ignoring the man's surprised look in the rearview mirror. Upon arriving at the mansion, the girls' expressions fluctuated between fear and awe at the imposing structure. Julian guided them inside with awkward gentleness, suddenly aware of how utterly unprepared his home was for children. He improvised dinner with whatever he found in the rarely used kitchen, showed them the bathroom, helped them get cleaned up, found some of his own t-shirts to serve as improvised nightgowns after a hot bath. Later, after settling them into one of the guest rooms, Julian was about to leave when he felt a small hand grab his. It was the youngest, hair still damp from the bath, looking at him with an expression combining innocence and ancient wisdom that was unsettling. "We know how to save you," she said simply, squeezing his fingers with surprising strength for such tiny hands. Julian froze, unable to process what he had just heard. How could she know? He hadn't told anyone about the diagnosis. Not even mentioned he was ill. Before he could formulate any response, the little one released his hand, yawned, and ran back to the bed, curling up next to the other 2, who were already fast asleep. Julian stayed at the door for long minutes, watching the 3 small bodies finally relaxed in safe sleep, trying to understand what had just happened, not only the strange statement from the child, but also his own impulsive action in bringing them home. He left quietly, closing the door behind him. He did not respond to the child's mysterious claim, but he did not forget it either. Julian Aramis awoke with a start. For a moment, he was disoriented, unable to identify what had pulled him out of sleep. His bedroom looked the same, minimalist, organized, the automated curtains filtering the morning light exactly to his preference. Then he heard it, a crystalline laugh, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. The reality of the previous night came flooding back. The 3 girls, the impulsive decision, the new arrangement under his perfectly controlled roof. Julian checked the clock. 6:47 a.m. He couldn't remember the last time he had woken up without the precise alarm at 5:30. He put on a silk robe over his pajamas, an unnecessary habit in a house where he had always lived alone, and headed toward the noises that were invading his routine. The scene in the kitchen stopped him in his tracks, unsure how to react. The oldest of the 3, Ivy, was standing on a chair dragged up to the counter, trying to reach the higher cupboards. The middle one, Sophie, was seated at the kitchen table, engrossed in drawing something on one of his expensive linen napkins with what looked like a pencil from his office desk. And the smallest, Lila, spun around the center of the kitchen, a blanket, apparently taken from the bed, tied around her head like an improvised turban. "Wizard, wizard, wizard of the forest," the little one sang, twirling until she got dizzy and plopped down, laughing at her own spinning head. None of them had noticed him yet. Julian remained still, like an anthropologist observing a newly discovered tribe. There was something both fascinating and unsettling about how quickly they had transformed the sterile environment into something alive. "Good morning," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. 3 heads turned simultaneously toward him. Ivy almost lost her balance on the chair. Sophie quickly covered her drawing with her hand, as if fearing scolding. Only Lila, still sitting on the floor with her improvised turban, grinned broadly. "Rich guy," she exclaimed, as though that were Julian's natural name. "We were looking for food," Ivy explained, descending nimbly from the chair. "We didn't want to wake you." There was a certain dignity in how the girl spoke, taking responsibility without apologizing. Julian realized she had probably been taking care of her sisters for long enough to develop that demeanor. "It's fine," he replied, feeling awkward in his own kitchen. "Let's have breakfast." The problem presented itself immediately. What exactly did they eat? Julian's refrigerator contained mostly pre-prepared meals by a private chef, individually packaged with detailed nutritional labels, nothing that seemed appropriate for children. In one drawer, there were protein bars, one of his rare snacks. "Do you like protein smoothies?" he asked, knowing how ridiculous it sounded even before he finished the sentence. "Smoothies? What's that?" Sophie spoke for the first time, her voice soft and curious. Julian realized he was utterly unprepared for this. In a career of billion-dollar decisions, he had faced hostile boards, tense international negotiations, market crises. But three little girls in his kitchen left him completely at a loss. "Let's order something," he decided, grabbing his phone. "What do you like for breakfast?" "Pancakes," Lila shouted immediately, leaping from the floor with renewed energy. "With chocolate syrup," Sophie added, still guarding her drawing. Ivy stayed silent, as if trying to determine if there was a catch to the question. Julian made the order: pancakes, waffles, fresh fruit, natural juices, a variety that would certainly exceed what three small children could consume. 40 minutes later, the kitchen table, which rarely saw any use beyond the occasional cup of coffee, was laden with colorful food, plates, cutlery, and three wide-eyed girls staring at the feast. "All this is for us?" Sophie asked in disbelief. "You can eat as much as you want," Julian replied, serving himself black coffee, his usual breakfast, regardless of the feast before him. He watched, fascinated, at how each one approached the meal differently. Ivy served her sisters first, making sure they had enough before taking her own share, like a little guardian. Sophie ate slowly, savoring every bite as if it were a new experience. Lila attacked the food with abandon, sticky chocolate syrup on her fingers, showing no concern for etiquette or moderation. "Back where we lived, we never ate so much," Sophie said, between careful bites of an apple. Julian felt a pang in his chest. How much hunger had these children known? "You can eat whenever you're hungry here," he said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "Always." After breakfast came the first of many awkward moments. What do you do with three children for an entire day? Julian had meetings, emails, corporate decisions still demanding his attention, even with his grim diagnosis, or perhaps especially because of it. There were procedures to settle, transitions to plan. He decided to improvise a space for them in his home office. He provided paper, colored pencils he found in a hurry. When had he bought them, he couldn't remember, and some electronic devices that might keep them entertained while he worked. The experiment lasted exactly 17 minutes. "Why is that painting on the wall? It's so weird," Sophie asked, pointing to an abstract canvas worth over $1 million. "What's your full name?" she continued, before Julian could even formulate a response about contemporary art. "Why do you live in such a big house alone?" she pressed on, immediately after he answered her previous question. "Do you have a girlfriend? Why does that clock make a different sound? Can you count to 1,000? The questions came in bursts, with no pause to breathe or elaborate a response. Meanwhile, Lila had discovered that the office's rolling chairs could spin, and she was now whirling until dizzy, squealing in delight with each turn. Ivy, though more reserved, systematically opened every drawer she could reach, examining the contents with barely disguised curiosity. "Does this place have a lot of rules?" she finally asked, when Julian gently requested that she not touch certain documents. The question hit him like a slap. How many rules had governed his entire life? Schedules, protocols, expectations, standards of behavior, all self-imposed, all rigorously followed. His house was a reflection of that, a space where every object had a designated place, where silence was the norm, where imperfection found no refuge. "No," he finally answered. "Not many." But as the morning shifted into afternoon, Julian realized he needed help. The three small presences required constant attention, their needs far more immediate and genuine than any corporate crisis he had ever faced. A quick online search and a few phone calls later, a specialized childcare agency promised to send someone experienced with impeccable references later that day. Julian sighed in relief. He could return to the office, maintain some semblance of his old routine, while he arranged something more permanent for the girls, whatever that meant. The nanny, a middle-aged woman named Clara, arrived in the early afternoon. Her experienced gaze took in the peculiar situation with admirable professionalism. A single billionaire attempting to work, while 3 children, clearly unrelated to him, transformed his immaculate mansion into a battleground of pillows, drawings, and endless questions. "Did you adopt?" she asked discreetly after the initial introductions. "It's temporary," Julian replied evasively. Clara nodded without pressing. "I see, they seem starved for attention. They've probably been through a lot." Julian didn't know how to respond. "They were on the street," he finally said, embarrassed by his own ignorance of the children's story that led him to bring them home. "I'll take good care of them while you work," Clara assured him. Children need routine, security, and plenty of affection to begin recovering from trauma. With Clara taking charge, Julian finally managed to retreat to his office. He closed the door, thinking he could recapture some sense of normalcy. But even with their voices muffled by distance, something had changed. His mind remained divided, part of him always attuned to the distant sounds, the laughter, the voices now permeating his home. The following days established a new routine. Julian tried to keep his distance, focusing on work, leaving the complexities of childcare to Clara. He was paying generously for it, after all. Clara was undoubtedly efficient. Within days, she had set schedules for meals, baths, educational and recreational activities. She bought suitable clothing for the girls, children's books, carefully selected toys for each age group. She converted one of the guest rooms into a colorful, welcoming space, with drawings on the walls and more child-friendly furniture. Julian observed these changes with a mixture of approval and discomfort. On one hand, his house had become unrecognizable. Walls once immaculate now sported children's drawings, minimalist spaces now invaded by colorful toys, the silence replaced by a cacophony of laughter, crying, and chatter. On the other hand, there was something inexplicably right about the transformation, as if the house, once a hollow shell, had finally found its purpose. Despite his supposed focus on work, Julian found himself returning home earlier on the first day, and the next, and the one after that. Video conferences now felt unbearably long, meetings endless. He found himself making excuses to leave early, rejecting business dinner invitations that once would have been top priority. By the first week, Clara noticed, "How you've been getting back earlier," she commented casually while preparing the girls' dinner. Julian shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "I've been working from home." But they both knew it wasn't true. He wasn't working during those late afternoons. He was sitting on the living room floor with Lila, feigning interest in her fantastical stories about dragons and princesses. He was listening to Sophie explain the peculiar logic behind her increasingly elaborate drawings. He was helping Ivy build impressive pillow and blanket forts. Subtle changes began to appear throughout the house. In the first week, colorful drawings appeared taped to the chrome refrigerator door, abstract works in bold strokes, signed in wobbly letters, "For the man with the big house, from Sophie." Julian's first instinct was to remove them, to maintain the minimalist aesthetic he always cherished. But his hand paused in midair, unable to undo that small, colorful mark on his monochromatic world. Instead, he found himself admiring the clumsy lines, trying to decode the shapes they were meant to represent. The next day, he found a cloth doll sitting on the Italian designer armchair he never used, a piece ignored since it was recommended by an interior design magazine. The doll assassin with button eyes and yarn hair looked oddly at home there, bringing life to a piece of furniture that had always been more a status statement than a functional item. In the main entrance, 3 pairs of colorful slippers, presumably bought by Clara, now formed an uneven row by the door, a striking contrast against the imported marble floor. Julian caught himself straightening them as he passed, unconsciously aligning them in a gesture that felt almost paternal, a gesture he never imagined he would make. Evenings brought another subtle transformation. After the first few days, in which he kept his distance during the bedtime routine managed by Clara, Julian began to show up in the girls' shared bedroom. At first, just for a quick good night, then to check if they were tucked in. Eventually, he stayed to answer requests for a story. On one particularly cold night, he entered the room after Clara had retired and found Lila uncovered, having kicked off the blanket during restless sleep. Instinctively, he knelt to cover her gently, tucking the fabric around her small shoulders. He watched her sleeping face, pink-cheeked, slightly parted lips, the expression of total surrender that only children achieve in deep sleep. Something inside him tightened, not pain, but something equally intense. As he stood up, he realized Ivy was watching him in the dark, her eyes glinting with a silent question. "Do you live here with us?" she said softly, not waking the others. "Or do you just visit?" The question caught him off guard. What exactly was he doing? What was this arrangement? A temporary shelter for 3 orphans while he found a more suitable solution. A peculiar social experiment undertaken by a man facing his own mortality, or something he wasn't yet ready to name. Julian began, then stopped. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he had no ready, calculated, precise answer. "I don't know," he finally admitted. Ivy nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "Good night, then," she said simply, turning over to sleep. Julian stood there for a moment in the darkness, watching 3 small figures who, in a matter of days, had completely changed the fabric of his existence. The house, once a monument to his loneliness, now pulsed with life. The silence, once constant, was now a rare, temporary visitor. He felt invaded, his spaces, his belongings, his routine, all claimed by tiny hands that neither asked permission nor knew or cared about the monetary value or exclusivity of the things they touched. And strangely, he also felt accompanied, not just physically, but in a deeper sense. As though a void that had existed for so long it had become part of him was now, little by little, being filled. Returning to his own room, Julian realized something fundamental was changing. For years, he had lived in a state of selective listening, tuned only to information relevant to his goals, filtering everything else as background noise. Now, he was beginning to hear. Really hear. Sophie's endless questions about how the world worked, questions he himself had long ceased to ask. Lila's half-asleep murmurs in her dreams. Ivy's subtly authoritative tone when organizing her sisters. And more, the rhythm of the house itself, gaining its own pulse, different from the mechanical tick-tock of the precise clocks that had once governed his existence. That night, Julian slept with his bedroom door open for the first time, telling himself it was to hear if any of them needed him. But the truth, which he wasn't quite ready to admit, was that the sound of other people's breathing in the house made his own breathing easier to bear. Heavy rain fell that night, turning the mansion's huge windows into watery screens where distant city lights danced in hypnotic patterns. The pounding of the raindrops against the glass created a sort of acoustic insulation, as if the house floated in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. Julian had sent Clara home earlier. The nanny, sensing the growing bond between the man and the girls, had gradually been stepping back in the evenings, allowing them to find their own rhythm as an unlikely family unit. After dinner, while distant thunder occasionally made Lila jump, Julian suggested a movie night in the living room, a space he had barely used before the girls arrived, despite the impressive audio-visual system installed. "Can we make a fort?" asked Sophie, already excited by the idea. Julian frowned, confused. "A fort? Yeah, with blankets and pillows," Ivy explained, already taking the lead. "We used to do that and before." Something in the way she said "before" made Julian nod without question. During the next half hour, the minimalist living room transformed into a cozy shelter of expensive Egyptian cotton sheets draped between sofas, piles of goose-down pillows strategically arranged, and subdued lighting creating an intimate atmosphere inside the makeshift structure. The result was absurdly incongruent with the house's decor and inexplicably perfect. Julian now found himself sitting on the floor, leaning against cushions, with Lila practically in his lap, Sophie at his right side, and Ivy keeping her characteristic watchful distance, though visibly more relaxed than in the early days. The chosen movie, a cartoon about a family of superheroes, had ended, but no one moved. The rain continued outside, the warmth inside the fort forming a bubble of comfort that no one seemed willing to leave. "Do you have a real dad?" Lila asked suddenly, turning her face to look at Julian. The silence that followed was palpable. Ivy shot her younger sister a warning look, but the question was already out, impossible to ignore. "Why do you ask?" Julian deflected, buying time, feeling suddenly vulnerable. "'Cause we don't have one anymore," Lila replied with the brutal honesty of a small child. "Our mum went to heaven." Julian felt Ivy's body tense, even at a distance. A delicate territory had been breached, not just his, but theirs. "When did that happen?" he asked softly, stepping into waters he had carefully avoided until now. "A while ago," answered Sophie, hugging her own knees. "She got sick and then slept forever." Her large eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Julian felt his chest tighten. Sick, slept forever. The words echoed within him, colliding with his own mortal diagnosis, still unshared. "It happened very fast," Ivy added, her voice deeper than seemed possible for someone so young. "One day she was fine, the next—" She didn't finish the sentence. Julian realized Ivy likely had more vivid, more painful memories. She carried not just her own grief, but the responsibility of protecting her younger sisters. "What about your dad?" Julian asked, dreading the answer. "Never had one," said Ivy simply. "Mom said he left before we were born." "All of you?" "Yes," Ivy replied, looking him straight in the eye. "We're real sisters. Same mom, same dad. He just didn't want anything to do with us." The restrained anger in Ivy's words revealed a forced maturity, a premature understanding of abandonment that made Julian recoil inside. What kind of man would walk away from three such extraordinary beings without looking back? "That's why we ran away from the shelter," Sophie continued, joining the conversation. "They were going to separate us, send each of us to different places." "How did you know that?" Julian asked, genuinely curious. "Ivy heard them talking," Sophie explained. "Then she made a plan, and we waited till night and snuck out." Julian looked at Ivy with new respect. The girl had organized an escape, kept her sisters together, and survived on the streets long enough until he found them, or they found him. He was no longer sure which version was true. "You were very brave," he said, sensing that any other comment would be inadequate given the magnitude of what they had endured. A comfortable silence followed, broken only by the sound of rain. The children had shared their story, a story of loss, abandonment, and fierce determination to stay together. Now the ball was in Julian's court. "And you? Do you have a mom and dad?" Sophie asked, returning the question with the same genuine curiosity. Julian hesitated. It had been decades since he spoke of it. In his meteoric rise in the corporate world, he had constructed a carefully edited narrative of his life, one that omitted any sign of vulnerability or abandonment. His official story, featured in magazine profiles and corporate bios, merely stated he was an only child and that the value of hard work was instilled early on. But here, in the intimacy of this makeshift fort, before three sets of eyes that had already seen more pain than they should, his protective layers felt unnecessary, even impossible to maintain. "My mom died when I was a kid," he finally said, the words rough in his throat. "I was 6, cancer." He felt the little weight of Lila pressing closer against him, an instinctive gesture of comfort that nearly shattered his composure. "And my dad." Julian took a deep breath. "He's still alive, but he was never there for me. After my mom died, he drowned himself in work. And alcohol, and I pulled away from him. It was a brutal simplification of years of neglect, of nights spent alone while his father worked or drank, of expensive gifts replacing presents, of impossible expectations and constant criticism. But it was the essential truth. Ivy's eyes met his, and Julian saw in them a recognition that no child should be able to express. The shared understanding of someone who took on responsibilities far too big, far too soon. Sophie's eyes brimmed with empathetic tears, and Lila simply reached out and held his hand, a gesture so simple and profound that Julian felt something break inside. No one said anything else. Say it wasn't necessary. In that moment, sitting on the floor of his billion-dollar mansion, surrounded by high thread count sheets forming an improvised shelter, Julian understood that he had found something his money had never been able to buy. People who understood his loneliness because they had experienced it too. A mirror of his own story of loss, reflected in the eyes of these three little survivors. The rain continued outside, but inside that fort, something had fundamentally changed. A connection had been formed, unseen but undeniably real, woven from the threads of shared stories, exposed vulnerabilities, and the silent recognition that, improbably, they had found one another precisely when they needed it most. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, a sharp contrast to the previous night's storm. Julian woke to muffled laughter in the hallway. He opened his eyes and watched a beam of sunlight crossing the window, forming a golden pattern on the ceiling. Something had shifted after last night's conversation. The vulnerability they had shared built a bridge between him and the girls, a mutual acknowledgement of similar wounds, similar emptiness. For the first time since receiving his diagnosis, Julian did not wake with that crushing heaviness in his chest. He got up, dressed casually, now a habit in recent weeks, and followed the sounds of children's voices. He found the three in the kitchen, attempting with little success to make breakfast. Flour was scattered across the counter, eggshells lay on the floor, and what looked like the start of pancake batter filled a large bowl. "We're making a surprise," Lila announced upon seeing him, her face and hair already covered in flour. "Ivy said we can do it by ourselves," Sophie explained, precariously balancing an egg in her hand. "But it's hard." Julian surveyed the scene. His immaculate kitchen transformed into a culinary war zone, three little figures intent on an impossible mission. Then something unexpected happened. He started to laugh. Not the polite, controlled laugh he used at social events. Not the brief, calculated chuckle in board meetings. A genuine laugh, starting deep in his throat and exploding uncontrollably, bending him over, bringing tears to his eyes. The girls stopped what they were doing, startled by his reaction. For a moment, they seemed uncertain, until Lila, infected by the laughter, joined him, followed by Sophie. Only Ivy kept a serious expression, though her lips trembled with the effort to contain a smile. "Sorry," Julian managed between laughs. "It's just, the kitchen is a mess," Ivy finished, finally allowing herself a smile. "We were going to clean it up afterward." "I'm sure you were," Julian said, wiping away a tear of laughter, trying to regain composure. "Let's do it together, all right? I can help." And so Julian Aramis, CEO of a billion-dollar conglomerate, found himself teaching three little girls how to make pancakes on a Sunday morning. He showed them how to crack eggs without scattering shells everywhere, how to measure ingredients properly, how to flip the pancake at exactly the right moment. Clara arrived mid-morning, finding the unusual scene in the kitchen. She stood at the door, observing Julian and the girls at the table, eating slightly misshapen yet edible pancakes amid lively chatter and laughter. "Good morning," she finally said, announcing her presence. "Clara," Sophie exclaimed. "We made pancakes with Julian." "I see," the nanny replied with a warm smile. "They look delicious." "Want to try some?" Julian offered, pulling out a chair. "There's plenty." Clara hesitated, then accepted, joining them for the improvised meal. Julian noticed how the dynamic had changed. In the first weeks, he had practically handed the girls over to Clara's care, keeping his distance. Now, they all seemed to form a cohesive unit, unusual, improbable, but working. The rest of the day passed with a lightness Julian hadn't experienced in years. In the backyard, he helped the girls create an improvised swing from an old tree. In the living room, he sat on the floor, listening to Sophie narrate fantastical stories about warrior princesses and friendly dragons, each one more absurd and captivating than the last. And then the princess said to the dragon, "You won't burn me because I know your secret." Sophie gestured dramatically as she recounted. And the dragon got really scared because his secret was that he couldn't swim and was afraid of water. Julian smiled, completely immersed in the narrative, while Lila, too excited by the story, twirled around the living room until she lost her balance and fell onto the rug, laughing at her own lack of coordination. He was surprised by the pleasure he felt in these simple moments, the satisfaction of teaching Ivy to chop fruit for an afternoon snack, the genuine attention he gave to Sophie's imaginative tales, the joy of watching Lila dance without any inhibitions. These were pleasures he had never included in his repertoire of experiences, small daily joys he had sacrificed in the relentless pursuit of success, corporate growth, the next acquisition, the next billion. Clara watched discreetly, intervening when necessary, but increasingly stepping back to let Julian take on the central, active role in the girls' lives. He was no longer just the man who hired her to care for them. He was now an integral part of their everyday world. That night, after dinner and bath time, came the moment that had become routine, the bedtime story. Usually, Clara read to them, with Julian occasionally showing up to say goodnight. But this time, when he walked into the girls' room for the nighttime ritual, Ivy surprised him. "Could you read the story tonight?" she asked, extending a book toward him. Julian glanced at Clara, who gave him a discreet smile before quietly leaving him alone with the three girls nestled in their big bed. He sat on the edge, taking the book Ivy offered, a story about a family of rabbits building a home in the woods. He opened to the first page and began to read, his voice initially firm and controlled. But as the story progressed, the father rabbit protecting his bunnies during a storm, teaching them how to find food, comforting them when they were scared. His voice began to waver. An unexpected emotion overwhelmed him, a sense of identification with that fictional character who was simply being a father. Julian realized the three were watching him intently, not just listening to the story, but gauging his reactions. Lila rested her head on his arm. Sophie sat cross-legged, wide-eyed with attention. And Ivy, ever observant, seemed to be studying him with an understanding beyond her years. By the time he reached the last page, his voice was hoarse with emotion. He closed the book gently, feeling the weight of that moment. "I liked how you read," Ivy said quietly. "You did different voices for each rabbit." Julian smiled, unable to speak. He adjusted the covers around them, checking they were comfortable, and leaned over to turn off the lamp. "Good night," he whispered, standing up to leave. "Good night, Julian," Sophie replied, eyes already closed. "Night-night," mumbled Lila, hugging a stuffed rabbit. "Good night." Ivy hesitated, as if considering something important. "Thank you for the story." Closing the door quietly behind him, Julian remained in the hallway for a moment, leaning against the wall, absorbing what had just happened. It wasn't just that he'd read them a story or spent a pleasant day together. It was something deeper, more fundamental. For the first time in his life, Julian Aramis felt like a father. Not a temporary guardian, not a distant benefactor, but someone essential and present in these children's lives. And the feeling was terrifying and wonderful all at once. Julian woke in a cold sweat. For an instant, he was disoriented, unable to pinpoint what had jolted him awake. The nightmare still pulsed through his consciousness, vivid images of a hospital, children's faces devastated by loss, broken promises. He sat up, breathing hard, while the final fragments of the dream dissipated, leaving only the visceral terror they had brought. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:27 a.m. The house was quiet, except for the distant hum of climate control and security systems. Julian ran his hands over his damp face, trying to calm his racing heart. The nightmare had been cruel in its simplicity. He was in a hospital, attached to machines, while Ivy, Sophie, and Lila watched from the doorway, tears in their eyes that would not fall, their small bodies rigid with the posture of those who have known abandonment before. In the dream, Julian desperately tried to explain, to promise he wasn't choosing to leave, that he didn't want to leave them. But no sound would come out, and the girls simply turned away, walking down an endless corridor until they disappeared. Now, sitting in his dark bedroom, the terror of the dream gave way to a reality just as terrifying: the cancer. The diagnosis that had been temporarily overshadowed by the revolution these three girls had brought into his life. 3 months, the doctor had said. Nearly a month had already passed since then. What if I die and leave them alone? He whispered to the empty room. I'll break them the way I was broken. The realization hit him hard. He was repeating differently, but just as traumatically, exactly what his father had done to him, abandoning a child at the moment they most needed stability and security. His father had withdrawn emotionally, drowning in work and alcohol. Julian was about to withdraw permanently through death's irrevocable door. Ivy, who already bore the weight of protecting her sisters. Sophie, with her sensitivity and endless questions about how the world worked. Lila, too young to fully grasp the concept of death, yet perfectly capable of feeling the emptiness of absence. They had already lost a mother. They had faced institutional care, the threat of separation, homelessness, and now when they finally found some stability, comfort, hope, he would give them yet another loss to bear. Julian shot to his feet, unable to stay in bed with these thoughts. He walked to the window, looking out at the sleeping city, its lights forming artificial constellations against the dark sky. What had he been thinking, anyway? That he could simply take in 3 children, form bonds and then vanish, leaving a hole in their lives precisely when they began to trust that maybe, just maybe, adults wouldn't always abandon them. No, that was too selfish. As much as their presence had filled a void in his own life, as much as their laughter had given color to his remaining days, he couldn't keep this going. The most responsible thing, the most painful yet correct, would be to find them a permanent home, a stable family with healthy parents, people who could be there for decades, not just weeks. Someone who could see them off to college, attend graduations, meet future partners, maybe even grandchildren one day. All the things Julian knew he would not live to see. With a bitter but firm resolve, he got back into bed, though he knew sleep wouldn't come easily. He had to act quickly. He couldn't allow their bonds to grow any stronger, making the inevitable separation even more traumatic. In the morning, as soon as the girls went down to breakfast with Clara, Julian locked himself in his office and made the call he had promised himself he would make. Child Protective Services, good morning, answered a female voice on the other end. Good morning. My name is Julian Aramis. I need to speak to someone about a foster case. 20 minutes and multiple transfers later, Julian finally scheduled a meeting with a senior social worker that very afternoon. He ended the call with a physical sense of nausea, like he had just signed a sentence. He avoided the kitchen, where he could hear the girls' excited voices and Clara's patient responses. He slipped out the back door without saying goodbye, unable to face those who, in so little time, had become the center of his world. The meeting at the austere offices of social services was as difficult as Julian anticipated. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Ramirez, had compassionate yet shrewd eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. She asked pointed questions about how the girls had come into his home. So you just found them on the street and took them in? She asked, her professional tone barely masking her disbelief. Julian shifted uncomfortably in the stiff chair. I know it seems irregular. It sounds like abduction, Mr. Aramis, the social worker corrected, though her tone wasn't accusatory. If not for the fact that they were apparently homeless and not under anyone's legal custody at the time. I should have contacted the authorities immediately, Julian admitted, but they said they ran away from a shelter because they were going to be separated. I just wanted to help. Dr. Ramirez studied him for a moment. Good intentions or not, the procedure was completely improper. Still, here we are now. You mentioned you're looking for permanent placement options. Julian swallowed hard. Yes, I want them placed in a permanent home. Together, it's crucial they stay together. That could be complicated. 3 sisters, different ages. Not many families are prepared for that kind of commitment. Julian hesitated. I can offer financial support, set up a fund for education, healthcare, future needs. I just want to ensure they have stability and stay together. The social worker regarded him with renewed interest. Why the sudden push for placement, Mr. Aramis? From your description, the girls seem to be adapting well in your home. You've hired professional help. You obviously have more than enough resources to care for them. Julian lowered his eyes. How could he explain? How to say he was dying? That any relationship he built with these children would be cut short in a matter of weeks. I have professional commitments that make it impossible for me to be the right guardian long term, he finally answered, hating the half-truth, but unable to voice the whole truth. Dr. Ramirez seemed unconvinced, but she made notes on her notepad. I'll begin searching for joint placement options. However, Mr. Aramis, I must warn you, this process isn't quick. It can take weeks, even months, to find a suitable family willing to take in 3 sisters at once. Weeks? Julian felt a chill run through him. Weeks meant the girls might still be with him when the end came. At minimum, the social worker confirmed. Meanwhile, if you're willing, the girls can remain under your temporary care. We'll need to formalize that, of course. There will be home visits, evaluations, a lot of paperwork. But given the unusual circumstances and the fact that separating them could cause more trauma, that seems the least disruptive option for now. Julian nodded mechanically, his mind racing with timelines, possibilities, scenarios. Leaving the grey government building with a folder of forms to formalize temporary custody, he felt the heavy sense that he had simultaneously done the right thing and the absolutely wrong thing. He returned home late in the afternoon, mentally exhausted and emotionally drained. The house was quiet when he entered. Clara had likely taken the girls out somewhere, now part of their routine. He climbed the stairs slowly, heading to his room for a few hours of solitude before the children's energy filled the rooms once more. Passing by the girls' bedroom, though, he noticed the door ajar. He peeked inside, thinking perhaps Clara and the girls had returned without him noticing. The room was empty, beds made, toys neatly arranged on the newly installed shelves. He was about to continue on when a colorful sheet of paper on Sophie's bed caught his eye. He walked in hesitantly, approached the bed and picked up what appeared to be a freshly drawn picture. Julian's heart seemed to stop for an instant as he took in Sophie's creation, 4 stick figures, holding hands, under what appeared to be the simple outline of a house. The tallest figure, obviously representing Julian, stood in the center with the 3 girls around him. Above the house, in large, colorful, wobbly letters, Sophie had written, "Our home." Julian felt his throat tighten, an emotional knot so intense he could barely breathe. His fingers trembled as he held the paper, absorbing every detail. How Sophie had drawn Ivy with her characteristic ponytail, how Lila's figure had a giant smile occupying half her round face, how they all had identical smiles, how the house sheltering them looked safe, solid, permanent. The first tear fell onto the paper before Julian realized he was crying. Soon his entire body trembled with silent sobs as he clutched the drawing to his chest, as if it were the most precious object in the world. He didn't know how long he stayed there, sitting on Sophie's bed, crying like he hadn't since childhood. When he finally regained some composure, the sky was already darkening outside and the house remained silent. Carefully, he placed the drawing back exactly where he found it. Then, with determined steps, he returned to his room, picked up the phone, and dialed social services once more. "Dr. Ramirez, Julian Aramis again. About our conversation today, there's been a change." Later that night, after Clara said her goodbyes and the girls were settled in bed, Julian entered their room quietly. He sat on the edge of the bed the 3 insisted on sharing, despite there being enough space for each to have her own. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, he watched their peaceful faces, each with its own sleeping expression, Ivy still vigilant even in rest, Sophie with her brows slightly furrowed as if dreaming of complex questions, Lila fully relaxed, a tiny smile on her lips. Ivy was the first to sense his presence, opening her eyes as she always did, watchful even in half-sleep. "Julian," she murmured, blinking to focus her vision. "Is something wrong?" The sound of her voice roused Sophie, who also sat up, rubbing her eyes. Even Lila stirred, though she kept her eyes closed, more asleep than awake. "I needed to talk to you," Julian said, his voice low and intense. "Even if it's late, even if you might not fully understand now." He paused, arranging the thoughts he had rehearsed for hours, but which suddenly felt inadequate under their attentive gaze. "I was scared," he finally went on, afraid to care too much about you, afraid you would care about me, afraid it would hurt everyone later. Ivy watched him with a comprehension beyond her years, as if she already knew exactly what he was trying, clumsily, to express. But now I see I'm the one who needs you, Julian continued, voice tight with emotion. You've brought something into my life I didn't even know was missing. And maybe I can bring something to yours too. As he spoke, Julian felt certainty grow within him. Yes, he was still dying. Yes, there would be pain in the future. But there would also be love. There would be family. There would be memories the girls could cherish, lessons he could teach, security he could offer, even if it was for less time than any of them deserved. To his surprise, Ivy moved first. The always cautious, always protective girl stood and, without hesitation, wrapped her arms around his neck in a tight hug. Julian felt her small body trembling against his, and he returned the embrace with equal intensity. Sophie came next, still half asleep but determined, placing a kiss on his cheek before joining the group hug. And finally, Lila, now fully awake, snuggled into his chest and whispered with the uncomplicated profundity of young children, "You're our daddy." The words struck Julian like lightning, knocking down his last defenses and dissolving his final doubts. He felt tears streaming freely down his face as he held the three of them, his unexpected treasures, his gift from the universe. "And you're my girls," he replied, his voice quavering. Right then, in that dimly lit room, cradling three small lives that had transformed his own, Julian Aramis made his decision. It didn't matter how long he had left, a year, 3 months, or just weeks. He would be the father they needed for as long as he could, without holding back, without reservations. He decided to stay completely. The following weeks brought a gradual yet profound change to the mansion's routine. Julian did not abandon his corporate empire. This would be impractical, even under the extraordinary circumstances, but he drastically scaled back his involvement. The perfectionist CEO who once micromanaged every aspect of his business now delegated with surprising ease. Priorities have changed, he explained succinctly during a board meeting, ignoring the puzzled stares of executives who had known him for years and never heard him speak of reducing his workload. No one dared question him, though rumors about his abrupt shift ran rampant through the company halls. The truth was too simple for the corporate world to grasp. Julian Aramis had discovered something more important than quarterly earnings and strategic acquisitions. His mornings, once dedicated to pre-dawn international video conferences, now began in the kitchen. He had learned to make breakfast, not merely ordering delivery, but actually cooking. His first attempts at scrambled eggs had been disastrous, eliciting genuine laughter from Ivy and politely confused expressions from Sophie, while Lila devoured everything indiscriminately, declaring it good even if burnt. Julian improved quickly. The same focus and determination he had applied to building his empire were now directed at mastering perfect pancakes and cutting fruit into fun shapes. Within weeks, breakfast became an eagerly anticipated ritual, not for the quality of the meal itself, but for the moments shared around the table. "Who wants to go with me to pick strawberries at the grocery store after school?" he asked one morning, pouring freshly squeezed orange juice. "Me, me," shouted Sophie. "Can we get that Belgian chocolate we saw on TV?" "If you finish your math homework first," Julian bargained, surprised at how naturally he had adopted the role of setting limits and rewards. The days took on a structure centered on the girls' needs, not the market's demands. Julian arranged his schedule to drive Ivy to school each morning. The eldest had been enrolled in a private school nearby, while Julian and Clara worked with social workers to settle the younger one's documents and education plans. Those morning drives with Ivy became precious to both of them. In the car on the way to school, the girl gradually lowered her guard, sharing small observations about her classmates, her lessons, her subtle fears of falling behind after so long without formal schooling. "What if I don't know stuff everyone else already knows?" she asked one morning, fingers fiddling nervously with her new backpack strap. "Then you learn," Julian replied simply. "Nobody's born knowing everything. The important thing is to keep trying." "You know all the adult things," she observed. Julian smiled. "Definitely not. I'm learning how to be a dad every day, and I make mistakes all the time." Those words seemed to comfort Ivy more than any elaborate reassurance could have. The idea that even adults were constantly learning and failing gave her permission to accept her own imperfections. Afternoons at the mansion took on a new dynamic. Julian set up a study table in the living room, not the formal office, where he helped Sophie with her first lessons. The inquisitive girl absorbed knowledge at an impressive rate, but needed constant redirection to stay on track. "Why is the ocean salty?" she'd ask, in the middle of a math exercise. "We finish the math first, then we'll explore the seas," Julian would reply, discovering a new reservoir of patience within himself. Meanwhile, Lila usually played nearby, building imaginary castles with blocks or dressing up in colorful fabrics Julian had bought specifically for her warrior princess costumes. By late afternoon, when homework was done and dinner still in the works, a tradition emerged: dancing with Lila. The little one would pick a song, usually something upbeat and entirely outside the musical universe Julian would choose on his own, and drag him by the hand to the middle of the room. There, the once powerful CEO abandoned any pretense of dignity, twirling, hopping, and improvising moves that elicited peals of laughter not just from Lila, but also from her sisters watching on. "You dance funny," Lila observed once, through giggles. "Funny how?" Julian asked, feigning offense. "Funny good," she clarified, hugging his legs. Clara was still around, a constant and stabilizing presence, but her role had subtly changed. She was no longer the primary caregiver in charge of all the girls' needs. She had become a partner, a supporter, someone who complemented but did not replace Julian's increasingly central presence. "You've changed," Clara remarked one afternoon as they watched the three girls play in the yard. Julian did not answer immediately, contemplating the transformation not just in his routine, but in the entire atmosphere of the house. The mansion, once a shrine to minimalist aesthetics and controlled silence, now pulsed with life. Toys lay forgotten in the most unlikely corners. Walls once reserved for expensive contemporary art now bore the girls' drawings, and small handprints appeared on glass surfaces that had once been impeccably spotless. The architectural perfection had given way to something far more valuable: a home. "No," he finally said with a slight smile, "I've just found what matters." And it was true. Amid the invisible ticking clock of his remaining days, Julian discovered the unexpected gift of a life fully lived, not measured in acquisitions or conquests, but in small moments of genuine connection. In Sophie's goodnight kiss, in Ivy's rare but priceless smile, in Lila's clumsy dance moves, in the calm certainty that, even if for a shorter time than anyone deserved, he had become a father in every sense. Sunday dawned with a light drizzle that painted the mansion's gardens in deeper shades of green. Julian was rearranging his old office, gradually transforming it into a friendlier space where the girls would also feel free to enter. The glass and steel walls remained, but now there were colorful cushions on the leather sofa. The girls' drawings framed with the same care once reserved for contemporary art pieces, and on the desk, photographs in frames, tiny glimpses of the new family taking shape. Rummaging through the bottom drawer of the furniture, looking for papers to discard, his fingers found something unexpected, a small box he hadn't seen in years. Opening it, he felt a pang in his chest. Amid old documents and forgotten childhood keepsakes was a yellowed photograph. A boy of about 5 years old perched on the shoulders of a young man, both smiling for the camera. Identical smiles, the same shape of lips, the same slightly squinty eyes when they laughed genuinely. The man gripped the boy's legs firmly, as though promising he wouldn't let him fall. Julian and his father. He stared at the photo for long minutes, sitting on the office floor, motionless except for his breathing, which grew ragged by the second. The image captured a time before his mother's death, before the distance and emotional withdrawal, before resentment and bitterness piled up year after year. Long suppressed memories began to surface. His father hadn't always been absent. There had been a time of backyard baseball games, bedtime stories, tickles and laughter. Once, long ago, that man had been Julian's entire world, until life, in its random cruelty, took Julian's mother away, and with her, much of his father as well. Now gazing at the photo through the lens of his own recent experience with fatherhood, Julian wondered how much of his father's subsequent absence had been conscious choice, and how much had been his inability to deal with his own pain while trying to raise a child alone. The question struck him like a revelation. For the first time in decades, Julian considered that perhaps his father hadn't simply decided to abandon him emotionally. Maybe he just hadn't known how to do it differently, how to be enough while he himself was shattered by loss. The realization shook him deeply. What would have happened if he, Julian, had not found the girls? If he faced his own mortality completely alone, without the transformation they'd brought to his life? Wouldn't he also have withdrawn further into himself, his work, his self-imposed loneliness? Ivy entered the office at that moment, interrupting his reflections. She watched Julian sitting on the floor for a few seconds, curious. "What's that?" she asked, coming closer to see the photo in his hands. "It's me," Julian replied, voice slightly hoarse. "With my dad." Ivy studied the picture intently, then glanced at Julian. "You look happy," she observed with childlike directness. "We were," Julian confirmed. "Back then. Where is he now?" The question hung heavily. Julian realized he didn't really know. He had kept himself deliberately distant for so many years that he wasn't even certain of his father's current whereabouts. Awkward holiday phone calls, a brief birthday card now and then, nothing more. "I'm not sure exactly," he admitted, ashamed of his own ignorance. "But I'm going to find out." 3 days later, Julian was driving down a tree-lined street in a suburban neighborhood. He parked in front of a modest, well-kept house with a small front garden where roses were just beginning to bloom. He checked the address on the crumpled piece of paper in his hand, information obtained after some phone calls and the hiring of a private investigator. For several minutes, he sat motionless in the car, breathing deeply, mentally rehearsing what he would say. How to condense decades of absence and hurt into coherent words. How to explain he was dying, that he finally understood something about fatherhood, that he had forgiven without even realizing until this moment. At last, he summoned the courage and walked to the door. Each step felt simultaneously heavy and light, the weight of all those years apart, balanced by the possibility of reconciliation. He rang the doorbell and waited, heart pounding like it hadn't since he was a teenager. The door opened, revealing a man with completely white hair, thinner and shorter than Julian remembered, or perhaps Julian had simply grown so much since truly looking at his father. His eyes, however, were the same as in the photo, same shape, same color, now encircled by deep wrinkles attesting to years and experiences Julian knew nothing about. The older man's surprise was evident. "Julian?" he asked, his voice trembling as though seeing a ghost. For an instant, all the carefully rehearsed lines vanished. Julian stood there in the doorway of his father's house, acutely aware of how surreal this unexpected visit must feel to the man before him. "Dad," he finally managed, the word sounding strange in his mouth after so many years not uttering it. Richard Aramis remained motionless, as though afraid any movement might make his son disappear. They studied each other in silence, absorbing the changes time had wrought in both. "I'm sick," Julian blurted out, words escaping before he could stop them. "But I'm happy. I have 3 daughters. I'm trying to be the father you weren't." The words were harsh, almost accusatory, but his tone carried none of the venom Julian once imagined he would feel upon facing his father. It was merely a statement, painful but honest. For a long moment, Richard said nothing. His eyes, so like Julian's, filled with tears. Then, without warning, he stepped forward and wrapped his son in a tight embrace, the first in more than 3 decades. Julian stiffened at first, shocked by the gesture. But gradually, something within him gave way. Like a long-pressured dam finally bursting, he allowed himself to be held by his father, then returned the embrace with equal intensity. "I'm here for you, son," Richard whispered against his shoulder. "Whatever you need." Something about those simple words, the offer of unconditional presence without questions or judgment, broke down the last walls. Julian felt tears running freely down his face and realized his father was also crying. They cried for everything they had lost, for the wasted time, for all the unspoken words, for every hug they hadn't shared. They cried like never before, together. And in that shared sobbing, feeling his father's arms around him for the first time since childhood, Julian realized there was one more lesson he needed to learn before leaving this world, the lesson of forgiveness, which he could now pass on to his daughters as well. The following months were a marathon of bureaucracy, psychological evaluations, social worker visits, and endless paperwork. The system designed to protect vulnerable children made no exceptions, not even for a man with the resources and influence of Julian Aramis. At times, the process felt almost insurmountable, especially when Julian had to privately disclose his medical condition to the evaluators. "How can we approve adoption by someone with such a limited prognosis?" one social worker asked during one of the more challenging evaluations. Julian took a deep breath before responding, "These children have already lost one mother. They know what grief is. What I'm offering them isn't forever, but stability, financial security, and above all, love for as long as I have left. I've made plans for their care after I'm gone." What Julian didn't mention was that his physician, puzzled yet optimistic, had noticed an unexpected stabilization in his condition. "I can't explain it," the specialist admitted at the last consultation, "but the tumor has stopped growing. We're not talking about a cure, but maybe more time than we initially predicted." Weeks turned into months. The girls thrived under Julian and Clara's care, with additional support from Richard, Julian's father, who had quickly taken on the role of a devoted grandfather, eager to make amends for his own mistakes through this new generation. Finally, on a sunny spring Thursday, the judge brought down the gavel for the last time, signing the final paperwork. Ivy, Sophie, and Lila officially became Ivy Aramis, Sophie Aramis, and Lila Aramis, the three daughters of Julian Aramis, recognized not just by the bonds of the heart, but by law as well. On the drive back from the courthouse, Julian watched the girls in the back seat, each processing the moment in her own way. Ivy, serious as ever, examined the official papers carefully, running her fingers over the printed names as though verifying their tangible reality. Sophie gazed out the window, lost in thought, occasionally smiling to herself. Lila simply chanted, "Aramis, Aramis, Aramis," in an improvised tune. "We have to celebrate," Julian announced. "What do you think?" "Party," Lila cried immediately. "A small party," Julian agreed. "Just us. Something special." He wanted nothing grand or ostentatious, no echoes of corporate extravagances that once filled his social calendar. This moment called for something intimate, authentic, reflecting the transformation his life had undergone. When they arrived home, Clara, Richard, and a small team of helpers had everything prepared, following Julian's precise instructions. The decorations were simple yet meaningful, flowers everywhere, arranged casually to bring color and life into the rooms. Colorful balloons floated against the living room ceiling. A handmade banner, created by Richard Daka, revealing an artistic talent Julian hadn't known his father possessed, hung on the main wall, reading simply, "Aramis Family." In the middle of the living room, a single cake stood on a low table, not a professionally crafted confection, but a homemade cake, slightly lopsided and imperfect, covered in colorful frosting with the three girls' names written in chocolate. Julian had discovered, to his own surprise, that he enjoyed baking. He'd spent the previous morning in the kitchen working on it, refusing any help. "It's perfect," Sophie whispered, her eyes wide as she gazed around. "It's ours," Ivy added, her usual composure momentarily softened by emotion. Lila simply ran around the room, touching every flower and balloon, as if she wanted to soak in the celebration through her fingertips. Julian had only invited the closest people, Clara, practically part of the family now, and Richard, carefully rebuilding his relationship with his son, Dr. Ramirez, the social worker who had overseen the case, was also invited as an official witness, but she politely declined, understanding this was a moment for the newly formalized family. Before cutting the cake, Julian cleared his throat, catching everyone's attention. He held 3 envelopes in his hands. "I wanted," he began. voice faltering slightly. He took a breath and started again. "I wrote something for each of you. I'm not good with spoken words, and so I put it on paper." He handed an envelope to each girl. Inside, each found a handwritten letter, something Julian had done in the quiet of night, revising and rewriting countless times until the words felt right. Ivy, the oldest, read hers silently, eyes moving quickly across the lines, hands trembling slightly. Sophie mouthed the words as she read, as if savoring each one. Lila, still learning to read, asked Sophie to read hers aloud. "You gave me a new life," Sophie read, her clear voice filling the room. "You taught me what true love is." Julian watched their expressions change as they absorbed his words, declarations of love, promises of presence, acknowledgments of their strength, and how they had transformed him. Ivy moved first. The girl who had always maintained a protective caution, a safe distance, walked deliberately across the room and wrapped her arms around Julian's waist, hugging him tightly. Sophie followed, fitting in on the other side. And finally, Leela, who ran and practically leaped into Julian's arms, completing the group hug. Julian closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of their small bodies pressed against him, the tangible love flowing between them. From the corner of the room, he caught sight of his father discreetly wiping away a tear, while Clara beamed with genuine happiness. It was official now. Paperwork signed, stamped, filed in some government office confirmed what their hearts had known for months. They were a family, complete, real, sharing a name and a future together, however long that future might be. The medical center still had the same antiseptic, impersonal air Julian remembered from his first visit, when he'd received the diagnosis that changed his life. The same neutral-toned walls, the same faint disinfectant smell, the same outdated magazines on the waiting room tables. But Julian was no longer the same man. Sitting in the chair across from the oncologist's desk, he watched the doctor's hands flipping through his latest test results with an expression oscillating between puzzlement and professional fascination. Dr. Morales, one of the most respected specialists in the country, had ordered a comprehensive series of tests when the initial results showed something unexpected. "Mr. Aramis," the doctor began, adjusting his glasses in a nervous habit Julian already recognized. "I must say I'm surprised by these results." Julian remained silent. In the months since he'd heard the initial prognosis of 3 months to live, he had slowly come to terms with his mortality. At first, acceptance sprang from hopelessness, the resignation of a man who saw his end on the horizon. Then, paradoxically, he found a different kind of acceptance through the girls, one that recognized life's finitude but celebrated every moment lived to the fullest. "The tumor," the doctor continued, choosing his words carefully. "The disease has stabilized." "Stabilized?" Julian repeated, uncertain of its exact medical meaning. "It stopped growing," Dr. Morales clarified. "Not only that, but there are signs of encapsulation. Your body seems to be isolating the tumor, forming a protective barrier around it. It's extremely rare for this type and stage of cancer." The doctor turned the computer monitor toward Julian, displaying side-by-side comparisons of previous and current scans. Even a layperson could see the difference. Where there had been an irregular, invasive mass before, there was now a more contained formation with clearer edges. "Does that mean—" Julian hesitated, not wanting to give voice to the hope forming in his mind. "This isn't a remission," the doctor hastened to clarify. "You still have cancer. But this stabilization significantly changes our expectations for disease progression." "How long?" Julian asked directly. Dr. Morales took a deep breath. "We don't have an explanation for what's happening. Despite all our advances, medicine still encounters cases that defy statistics and predictions. But it does happen." He removed his glasses, wiping them with a cloth, a gesture that gave him time to gather his thoughts. "If this stabilization continues at its current pace, we're no longer talking about months, Mr. Aramis. We could be talking about years." The word fell into the office like a revelation. Years. Not weeks or months, anxiously counted like grains of sand in an almost empty hourglass. Years. "I want to be clear," the doctor continued in the cautious tone characteristic of his profession. "We can't guarantee anything. We'll need constant monitoring, regular tests. And there's always the risk of a sudden change. Julian nodded mechanically, his thoughts already far from the office, imagining all the possible outcomes of this unexpected news. Years meant seeing Ivy enter her teenage phase, meant following Sophie's burgeoning scientific curiosity through more and more experiments. Meant more clumsy dancing with Lila, more bedtime stories, more Sunday breakfasts. Mr. Aramis, the doctor's voice brought him back to the present. Any questions? Julian realized he was smiling, a small, reserved, but genuine smile. No, doctor. Not for now. May I ask? The doctor hesitated, curiosity wrestling with professional decorum. Have there been significant changes in your life since the initial diagnosis? Stress levels, diet, exercise? Julian considered the question. How to explain the complete transformation his existence had undergone? How to convey in clinical terms the revolution caused by three little presences who had filled what was once an empty life? Some changes, yes, he answered simply. I adopted 3 daughters. Dr. Morales blinked, clearly taken aback by the unexpected reply. I see, he said, though it was clear he didn't fully comprehend. Well, whatever the cause, these results are encouraging. Let's schedule your next test in 3 months and keep monitoring. Julian left the medical center to a sunny autumn day. In the parking lot, he sat in his car for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of the news. It wasn't a cure, not even a promise, but it was time, the most precious gift he could have asked for. The drive home felt shorter than ever. The trees lining the suburban streets displayed red and gold leaves. Catching the afternoon sun in a display Julian realized he had never truly observed before. Pulling up to the mansion, he spotted the silhouettes of the girls through the windows, probably just back from school, tossing backpacks aside, all talking at once as they usually did. He entered quietly, watching them from a distance for a moment, savoring a mundane scene as the miracle it truly was. When they finally noticed his presence, all 3 ran toward him, Lila in front, ever the most enthusiastic, followed by Sophie waving her latest drawing, and Ivy bringing up the rear with her discreet but genuine smile. Julian opened his arms and swept them into a tight hug, tears silently gathering in his eyes. He said nothing about the doctor's visit, the tests, or the revised prognosis. No words were needed, only the silent gratitude of a man who had been granted not just extra time, but the insight to use it well. Ivy, ever attentive to subtle changes, looked up at Julian's face, noticing the tearful gleam. Everything okay? She asked softly. Julian nodded, discreetly wiping his eyes. Better than okay. He didn't know exactly how long he had. In truth, no one ever really does. But at that moment, surrounded by his daughters in the sunlit hallway of the home that was now truly his, Julian Aramis knew with absolute certainty how he would spend whatever time remained. The idea came up spontaneously during Sunday breakfast, as Lila doodled on the fogged-up window, asking what the countryside looked like. Julian was startled to learn that none of the girls had memories of trips beyond the city. You've never seen a farm, animals, green hills? He asked, flipping another pancake onto a plate. All 3 shook their heads, curious about this place that seemed to fascinate Julian so much. Mom always said she'd take us someday, Sophie commented, but then it never happened. Her answer clenched Julian's heart. How many promises interrupted by life had these children already accumulated? How many one-day moments never fulfilled? We're going today, he decided, ignoring the Monday schedule he had mapped out in his head. Right now. The instant joy on the girls' faces was all the confirmation he needed. Breakfast swiftly became a small chaos of preparations. Julian, used to having assistants coordinate every detail of his trips, found himself improvising picnic baskets, searching for blankets, filling water bottles, and responding to a barrage of questions. Are there real cows? Can we touch them? Is there a place for us to sleep? Will the animals bite? Julian laughed, overwhelmed but genuinely happy at their excitement. We're not staying overnight, just a day trip. But if you like it, we can plan a longer visit during vacation. 3 hours later, The car left the last traces of the city behind. The urban landscape of buildings and concrete gradually gave way to a completely different view. Gentle hills covered with vegetation, open fields where the wind rippled through tall grass, occasional clusters of old trees standing like silent sentinels watching the passage of seasons. In the backseat, Ivy, Sophie, and Lila pressed their faces to the windows, absorbing every detail of this new experience. Their excitement was infectious, and Julian realized he was also seeing the scenery with fresh eyes, not as the blurred backdrop of rushed business travel, but as a living, breathing landscape. They stopped at a small farm run by friends of Richard, Julian's father. The place was modest but charming, a wooden house with a wide porch, red barns, well-maintained pastures where cows and horses grazed peacefully, and a small pond surrounded by willows at the far end of the property. The welcome was warm. The owners, a middle-aged couple named Elena and Marco, seemed delighted at the chance to show city children around. "The girls have never seen farm animals," Julian explained. "Then we have a lot to show them," Marco exclaimed, leading the group toward the stable, where a newborn foal shyly hid behind its mother. The following hours were a kaleidoscope of discoveries. Julian watched unfascinated at how each girl interacted with this new world in her own unique way, revealing facets of their personalities that urban life might never have let bloom. Ivy, normally so composed and watchful, showed a surprising gift with the animals. The mare, initially skittish around strangers, allowed her to approach, and the farm dog followed her as though they'd been friends for years. "You've got a knack," Elena remarked, impressed. "Some people are just born with it, an instant connection to animals." Ivy blushed at the praise, trying to hide her proud smile, but Julian noticed she stayed near the stables for the rest of the day. Sophie, meanwhile, became a walking encyclopedia of questions. Every plant, insect, or piece of farming equipment sparked another string of how and why, which Marco answered with patient amusement. Julian realized, for the first time, that Sophie's endless queries were finding truly satisfying responses, tangible, practical explanations tied to the land and the natural cycles. And Lila, the smallest and most vibrant, ran through open fields with her arms stretched wide, laughing with complete abandon, trying to mimic the birds' calls, rolling in the grass without a care for stains or dirt. Her joy was so pure and unself-conscious that Julian felt a lump in his throat watching her. After lunch, a simple but delicious picnic under a century-old oak tree, Elena suggested they try the rope swing hung from one of its strongest branches. For nearly an hour, Julian took turns pushing each of the girls on the makeshift swing, hearing their delighted shrieks, watching their hair fly in the breeze, feeling their small hands gripping the rope with total faith that he would not let them fall. As the sun sank toward the horizon, Julian gathered his girls for a final walk to the pond. They sat on the soft grass by the water, watching the sunlight paint the surface in shades of orange and gold. It was one of those perfect moments that seemed to exist outside of time, the kind of moment Julian, in his former life of meetings and acquisitions, would never have noticed, let alone appreciated. Now he savored each second like a priceless gift. "I thought I'd die without ever really living," he said softly, words escaping almost unconsciously. "But you saved me." The three looked at him with different degrees of understanding. Lila, not fully grasping the gravity of his words, but sensing the emotion behind them, simply laid her head in Julian's lap, gazing at the sky where the first stars were starting to appear. Sophie came closer and took Julian's hand, placing a gentle kiss on his fingers, a gesture she'd learned from him when he kissed her little scrapes to take the pain away. It was Ivy, however, who met his gaze directly. The oldest girl, always observant, always aware of more than she revealed, smiled in a serious, deeply mature way. "You saved us too," she said simply. In those few words lay all the unspoken history, the nights on the street, the fear of separation, the hunger, the uncertainty, the abandonment, and also everything that came after: security, kindness, a restored family, the chance to just be children again. Julian wrapped his arms around all three, feeling their warmth, the trust with which they nestled against him. the fragile yet fierce strength they embodied. None of them spoke another word. There was no need. There, framed by a sunset in a field far from the city, there were no diagnoses, no prognoses, no backup plans or future worries. There was no room for past or future pain. There was only the present moment, filled to the brim with the purest love, the kind that heals, transforms, and saves. The kind that, against all medical odds, might just be granting Julian not only a reason to live out his remaining time, but also, miraculously, more time to live. A year had passed. A year of regular checkups, small victories, and normal days that now seemed extraordinary simply because they existed. The paper calendar in the kitchen, not the sleek digital model embedded in a smart fridge, but an old-fashioned one decorated with colorful drawings and different handwriting, marked the exact anniversary of the day Julian had discovered 3 small figures under a blanket on the sidewalk. 12 months, 52 weeks, 365 days he hadn't expected to have. 365 days that changed everything. The mansion, once a testament to contemporary design and corporate success, was unrecognizable to anyone who'd seen it before. The pristine white walls were now covered in colorful handprints, framed drawings and countless photographs. The designer furniture, once perfectly aligned, had been rearranged into more practical configurations for conversation and board games. Books lay on every table. Toys were scattered in the most unlikely corners, and pencil marks marred the hallway wall where Julian diligently recorded each girl's increasing height. In the kitchen, the smell of a chocolate cake filled the air as it finished baking. Julian had discovered a surprising aptitude for baking, finding therapeutic satisfaction in creating desserts that made his daughter's eyes shine. The world's best dad baker, Sophie had proclaimed on her last birthday, when Julian unveiled an elaborate dinosaur-shaped cake for her party. Dad. The word still stirred emotion every time he heard it. At certain moments, it felt like a miracle that he, Julian Aramis, had become the father of 3 extraordinary girls who now proudly shared his last name. Most surprising of all was how fatherhood had entirely restructured his relationship with time. The man who once lived perpetually in the future, always thinking of the next deal, the next quarter, the next fiscal year, now lived fully in the present. The value of each moment was no longer measured by productivity or growth potential, but by laughter, discoveries, and small daily triumphs. Julian worked less. He had delegated the day-to-day management of his conglomerate to a talented team, retaining only strategic supervision and a few critical decisions. His priorities had shifted so radically that even his closest colleagues noticed the difference, not only in his more limited schedule, but in his more human approach, more sensitive to factors he once might have dismissed as intangibles. "You seem different," his CFO remarked after a recent meeting. "I'm alive," Julian responded simply. And he was. More alive than he could ever remember being, even before the diagnosis that had once put him on borrowed time. The latest tests showed the disease still stabilized, in a sort of inexplicable ceasefire that his doctors observed with cautious professionalism and thinly veiled amazement. Julian didn't seek explanations. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was his physiological response to less stress and more happiness. Maybe it was simply random chance. Or maybe, as Lila suggested with a child's innocent wisdom, your heart got stronger because now it's full of love. The afternoon was exceptionally pleasant. The backyard, redesigned not for award-winning landscaping but for playtime, was brimming with the girls' energy. Ivy, on the cusp of adolescence, had developed an interest in photography and roamed the garden with a camera, capturing images of flowers, insects, and her sisters at play. Sophie, whose restless mind continued to seek explanations for everything, had set up a science station under a tree, conducting some kind of experiment with dirt, water, and fallen leaves, taking notes in a little notebook with the seriousness of a seasoned researcher. And Lila, the youngest, danced as usual, spinning around the lawn in an improvised choreography, occasionally chatting with imaginary companions or humming to herself in a language only she fully understood. Julian watched from the porch, a cup of coffee in his hands. Clara had left early, Her services, though still appreciated, had become less essential as Julian's life adjusted to being the primary parent. Richard, his own father, was due to arrive later for a family anniversary dinner, as they called this date. A year ago, Julian had believed he was nearing the end. Now he knew he was only at the beginning of something far greater than himself. Ivy looked up from her camera and saw him watching. She waved, her face lit by a smile that looked more like a young woman's than a child's. He waved back, amazed by her transformation, from a defensive, wary girl to this self-assured preteen who still had a protective nature, but now allowed herself to be protected as well. Sophie, noticing the interaction, dropped her experiment and ran over to the porch. "Is the cake done? I can smell it from here." "Almost, Julian said, checking his watch. 10 more minutes, scientist." Satisfied, Sophie returned to her station, not without first shouting to Lila, "10 minutes till cake." Lila replied with an enthusiastic wave and a full spin, as though the news of cake deserved a special dance routine. Julian smiled, feeling a fulfillment he never imagined possible. The future, once a source of dread under his terminal diagnosis, no longer frightened him. Not because he had medical guarantees, his doctors were still cautious, but because he was too busy living in the present to be worried about what might come next. He had, of course, taken care of practicalities. The girls were financially secure. Richard had pledged to assume guardianship if anything happened. Julian had written letters for every significant milestone he might miss: graduations, weddings, the arrival of possible grandchildren. But those precautions didn't dominate his thoughts. They were simply responsible measures taken by a man who had learned to love without fear, not the fear of losing, which is inevitable for everyone, but the fear of loving wholeheartedly, of giving himself completely. The timer on his phone buzzed, announcing the cake was ready. Julian stood to go inside, but paused for a moment, taking in the scene. The three sisters in the sunlit backyard, laughter echoing, their vibrant existence entwined with his. He closed his eyes for a moment, imprinting that scene not just in his memory, but in every fiber of his being. When he opened them again, tears shone, but they were tears of pure gratitude, not sadness. "Now I've truly lived," he murmured to himself. And then he went in to take the cake out of the oven, call the girls, whip up the chocolate frosting Lila would insist on spreading, hear Sophie's latest scientific discoveries, and admire Ivy's photographs from the day. There was an anniversary dinner to prepare, stories to listen to, laughter to share, memories to create. There was life, imperfect and unpredictable, unfinished, yet utterly wonderful in its simplicity. And for Julian Aramis, that was everything. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.